story news. Didn't fit my picture of the world, but it talked about the funeral ceremony for de Gaulle, and it said that the president was there, and that in the reception after the funeral, he had met Mr. Podgorny of the Soviet Union, and the two of them talked. Now, you know, there are some documents that are missing in history. And this 11-minute talk that was reported in the State Journal this morning really conjures up a tremendous amount of one's imagination. It says that they talked first of all about the city. Nixon said, "Where are you from?" Ukraine. And Nixon said, "Oh, I'm from California." Which is really, you know, a big signal in his conversation. And they exchanged information about cities they had seen and visited. He said in the newspaper that for the rest of the time they discussed ballet. Now, I can tell you that that's really nice. Discussing ballet really intrigues me. And that faceless bureaucrat who heads the Soviet Union responding intrigues me no less. Consequently, one wonders really what kind of immortal thoughts about 20th century art are lost because that wasn't recorded.
Of market economy in that new economic policy. A profound shift in alteration in the direction of Soviet history. Consider it please that at that very same Congress in March of 1921, there were rules passed that made internal discussion and debate within the Russian Communist Party a much more difficult thing. That in coping with that so-called workers' opposition of Lyaknikov and Kolantai, it was now said by the 10th Congress that factions were not permissible within the Communist Party, and that factionalists would be thrown out and expelled by a vote of the Central Committee. In effect, what was being said was that Russia needed a very strong centralization within the hands of her bureaucrats, and that it was no time now to suffer controversy and debate within the party structure or within the state structure. And consider if you please that in that same March of 1921 happened the event that helped to explain those seismic shifts. Because the events of March that I'm referring to are those events in Germany, which see the real collapse of the post-war German Revolution. That abortive uprising of March of 1921, which saw a kind of revolutionary offensive not only defeated but really crushed. And it meant something very profound. It meant that the Russians, after all, recognized that they would live surrounded by a capitalist world for a foreseeable future. That there would not be that revolution in the West that would come to rescue them and to succor their own revolution. And that consequently, there had to be a new strategy of waiting. That the Communist Party understand what it is that happened in March of 1921 in Germany, and what the consequences of that were. Now, there is no point for us to immerse ourselves in the immense detail of the so-called March action in Germany. A very detailed, a very expensive kind of story. But what we must do is ask certain questions of that March action of 1921. Because in answering those questions, we not only learn about that event, but we really learn about strategy, about the strategy of social change, and we learn about it in depth. We ask the question, first of all, what was at the root of this March action? Why should such a peculiar thing have taken place? Something that proved to be so catastrophic, a revolutionary offensive when the times really should not have permitted that. And in answering that question, you see, we bore upon some very important understandings. We bore upon the fact that there are at times impetuous and impatient and very juvenile revolutionaries, as there were in the German Communist Party in 1921, who not only pitted their will against history, but who eliminated history history completely, who insisted that it was possible to make a revolution when none of the context really offered that possibility. And we learned likewise that there were very self-interested men in the Comintern, people who really were the leading bureaucrats of the Comintern, who were going to utilize the communist parties of Europe for their own designs and their own ends, as surely happened in the March action of 1921. And we will ask the second question. Once that defeat was consummated, and it was certain, what kind of a reaction did the communists of Europe take to that particular defeat? And that question is terribly important, because the German communists who were responsible for falling into that trap tried to defend themselves by saying that they had won a victory, refused to look at it as the defeat that it really was. And even the Comintern leaders, people like Radek and Bukharin and Zinoviev, tried to put the best face on that particular action, refusing, after all, to read the lessons of it. But you see, they ran into a stone wall, that stone wall of revolutionary integrity, which were Lenin and Trotsky. And Lenin and Trotsky insisted at that Third World Congress in July of 1921 that you examine what went wrong, that you admit your defeat, and that you learn from your defeats, because if you are to carry on that struggle, you do not make the same mistake twice. And then a third question that we ask of these March events, and that is, what are the overall consequences? And those overall consequences really do see a redirection of the European social movement and a kind of period of stabilization setting into Europe. And so we ask the root of the March action. How did it come about? And it came about from several factors. There was, first of all, the resignation in January of 1921 of Paul Levy as the president of the German Communist Party, the leader of that German Communist Party. Now, Levy was no flaming insurrectionary, but he was an extremely brilliant strategist. And what he had done in building the German Communist Party was to turn against all kinds of pushism. Pushism was something that he considered a terrible danger. He knew that that was the legacy and the inheritance of Spartacusm. That in the Spartacist movement right after the war, all sorts of open proletarian elements had filtered into the party, that they had had an insurrectionary zeal, and that they had been responsible in January of 1919 for the murders of Rosa and of Karl. And they had been responsible for the murder of Yoga Chase in March of 1919. And what Levy did in his party building was to eliminate, in 1919, those anarcho-syndicalist elements, and finally in 1920, to fuse with part of the Independent Socialist Party in order to build a large party which he would not risk. His idea was to use that vast party to fan out and to build an even larger infrastructure of support. And consequently, he came forth in January of 1921 with a proposal that was published in Rosa Fama on the 8th of January, a kind of strategy. What Levy said was that what we must do is to make overtures toward the other working class organizations, to the SPD, to the Independent Socialists, to the trade unions, and we must say that we will engage in common actions with them, because after all, they have enrolled part of the German working class, and indeed the majority. And we will make these common actions in favor of raising wages, in favor of improving living conditions. And why? Not for reformist ends, but in order to weed the workers away from those organizations. It is already the strategy of what will be called going to the mass, or the strategy of the United Front. That you try a united front with the other organizations, and when they prove to be not really revolutionary, when they desert their own working class, then you win them over into communism. Now that kind of a long-range strategy didn't sit well with the left wing of the German Communist Party. I'm talking about an extreme ultra-left wing headed by Ruth Fischer with her great friend Maslow and her friend Ernst Reuter, but I'm also talking about a Comintern wing, a wing like Brandler and Thalheimer and Freulich, people who thought that the Comintern had the right line all the time and became his very faithful servant. And this left wing of the party, very dissatisfied with Lenin's leadership, and finally he tripped up. He gave them an issue to oust him because he went down to Italy in January of 1921 to attend the Livorno Congress of the Italian Socialist Party. And there were the Comintern agents, Rakosi and Joseph Pepper, the Hungarians. And there they were telling the Italians, you must throw out your reformist wing, and the Italians refused. And Saracchi would not make that schism that the Comintern was demanding, and consequently the communists withdrew, or the left wing withdrew and formed its own party. Now Lenin went back to Germany and published articles attacking the Comintern, attacking Rakosi and that Comintern interference, and saying the Italians were perfectly right in not wanting to engage in precipitate action, and that caused his downfall. Because Rakosi, on the way back to Russia, stopped off in Berlin, insisted that the Central Committee of the German Communist Party censure Lazy, which they did do, and consequently he resigned. And when he resigned, it was Heinrich Bromberg who became the head of the German Communist Party, who was a very faithful servant of the Comintern, and whose wing was to the left of the Lazy leadership. So that you get an important shift in leadership and in perspective. Because Bromberg and his group were very responsive to what is the second force behind this march action. Very responsive to a theory coming out of the Comintern, which was the theory of the revolutionary offensive. Now, in the Comintern, there developed organically what was called the Little Bureau. The Little Bureau was a kind of inner core of people who really were running the executive committee of the Communist International. And that Little Bureau was composed of Karl Radek, Bukharin, and Zinoviev. And those three men, all of them, represented a certain kind of left, a certain kind of insurgency, especially Radek. And consequently, this Little Bureau developed this notion of the revolutionary offensive, which went something like this: that Europe really was in a revolutionary moment, that the situation was right, and that what was wrong was the kind of lethargy of the Communist Party, that they would not take advantage of situations, that all that was necessary in order to catalyze revolution was provocation. In other words, it is the tactic of deliberate provocation or the manufactured revolution, that things are so tense, especially in Germany, that if there are certain bombings or if there are certain actions of an exemplary kind, that there will be a catalysis to the revolution. And consequently, what this Little Bureau was saying was that revolution is possible in Germany. Now, parenthetically, that is a peculiar position to hold, because it is held exactly at the time that Lenin is making his retreat, that Lenin is establishing NEP and the new economic policy, part of which was predicated on the idea of friendship with the capitalist government outside of Russia, that Russia needed a breathing space, and here is this Little Bureau of his comrades in the International talking about provoking a revolution. The explanation lies here, that the men in the Little Bureau really wanted to avoid that. It was their idea that if a revolution came immediately and at once, Russia would not have to take this backward step, would not have to make her capitulation to a market economy, would not have to concede to the peasants. And consequently, it might be possible to avoid that. The revolution in Germany would give Russia all of the technical help, all of the infrastructure of science that she actually needed to build socialism without these concessions to the market. Lenin had no such illusion. Lenin was highly realistic about this. Lenin put it very bluntly. He said our party must be one step ahead of the masses, but never two steps ahead. They are tired, and we must retreat for the moment. And so far as manufactured insurrection is concerned, so disciplined a revolutionary as Lenin had nothing but contempt for it. And we have the memoir, the reminiscences of Clara Zetkin. And Zarazetkin, that great German socialist who became communist, Zarazetkin went to Moscow after the March action and saw her old friend Lenin and said it was a terrible action, this manufactured revolution which caused us defeat. What is it that you think about it? I am afraid that they will come here, our German comrades, and they will be whitewashed by the commentary at its meeting. What is it that you think? She asked Lenin, and Lenin replied, since you have joined the pessimists, rest assured, the theoricians of the offensive will not rise the crest of the wave during the coming Congress. We have still to be reckoned with. Do you think we made the revolution without learning from it? And we want you to learn from it as well. Can it actually be called a theory, this revolutionary offensive? Beware, it is an illusion. It is nothing but romanticism. It is for this reason that it was fabricated from the land of the poets and thinkers, referring to Hungary, with the aid of my dear Bella, who also belongs to a poetically gifted nation and who considers himself obliged to be constantly more or less than the left. We cannot afford to write poetry and to dream. We have to view the world's economic and political situation soberly, entirely soberly, if we want to take up and win the battle against the bourgeoisie. And we want to win, and we have to win. The decision of the Congress on the tactic of the Communist International and all the controversial questions connected with it has to be related to and viewed in conjunction with our theses on the international economic situation. All of this must have unity. For the time being, we will listen to Marx, not to Bella. And consequently, Lenin says no to that sort of thing, but he wasn't in on the planning. Because the third force of this March action is the measure that was sent from the Little Bureau to Germany at the beginning of March, a mission headed by Bella. Now, Bella, you must understand, is really a psychological case in 1921. He is a defeated communist leader, and he truly feels the necessity of redeeming himself, of reclaiming himself. He even has delusions, and he said to somebody in Germany in 1921 that this revolution will be so great, I will be considered on the plane with Lenin. And consequently, Bella comes. And he makes his interrogation on the spot. And he asks what the apparat has done, what the clandestine organization has done. Where are the armed workers? What are they ready to take? And the answer is they haven't done anything. We don't have an apparat. He said, too bad, we have the insurrection anyway. We bring this proposition before the Central Committee of the German Communist Party, and it was debated on the 16th and 17th of March, and the view was that an insurrection within a number of weeks after certain planning might really be possible because of conditions in Germany. But the fourth source of this insurrection is the co-optation of the insurrection by the government itself. Because really, it was the offensive of the government which created this insurrection. It was the government that chose the time and the place, and consequently setting a trap into which the German communists went. Because at the very time that the Central Committee of the KKK was discussing that issue, there was already on the 16th of March an order that went out from the governor of Prussian Saxony that province of Prussian Saxony would be occupied with police in order to restore law and order. Now that governor of Prussian Saxony was Otto Herzing, and his idea was that in that province of Saxony, which had those heavily industrialized areas of Mansfeld and Ebersheim, in those particular areas, there had been a tremendous amount of working class agitation. It was, after all, the area in which you have the great Weimar chemical works. And those chemical works were the scene of some of the greatest clashes between workers and police. You have unemployment in that area of chemicals and mining. You have all kinds of semi-employment. You have strikes. And ultimately you have theft and sabotage in the factories and the mines. You have a very radical working class which is joining the Communist Party in that particular area, especially in Mansfeld itself. And consequently, the idea of the governor was to restore order. But no sooner given that particular edict that he would send police in. Then the Minister of the Interior of Prussia, Karl Severin, himself got into the act, and his purpose was not just to restore order. His purpose was to kill off the communist movement, and consequently, he was making a state provocation. Now, Severin, you see, is a classic type. He's very much like Marcelin, the Minister of the Interior in France today, or like John Mitchell. They're people, after all, who see plots everywhere. They're people who think that, after all, any little action already means that the ramparts of the society are falling, and consequently that you must make a great, big, massive riposte to that. Well, what Severin saw, and it's a very instructive thing, is a bombing in Berlin on the 13th of March of 1921. It was a kind of a half-crazed terrorist, a man named Paris, who put 6 kilos of dynamite at the base of a statue in central Berlin. It was actually a monument called the Monument to Victory. And it had been a sort of a classic thing in the center of Berlin. It was a big chip, a big damage. Nobody was hurt, but it seemed to Severin like the beginning of a tremendous insurrection. And consequently, what had to be done was to pour these police into Prussian Saxony, not only to restore order, but to extirpate the roots of this entire communist movement in that area. And on the 19th of March of 1921, the police began to pour in by the thousands into the province of Prussian Saxony. Now, what was the riposte of the Communist Party, and that was the fifth source of this insurrection? The riposte is to fall into the trap. Now, granted that there was a tension in Germany, granted that in January of 1921, there had been a partial occupation of the Ruhr by French troops, 3 cities, in failure of the Germans to pay their reparations. Granted that there were freebooters marching around Bavaria, for example, who simply were looting and the like. There was a tension in the country, but there wasn't a revolutionary crest. In other words, what you had were still most of the workers in the more reformist organizations, like the SPD and the trade unions. You had the government, the national government, still pretty stable. What you had was a situation in which the communists, if they had resisted the trap, might have deepened the understanding of the workers of what kind of contradictions there were in society. In other words, they might have gone out and tried to recruit rather than falling into a trap, or they might have engaged in a defensive, not an offensive action. They might have got mass support, after all, if they had gone to the working class and even to the budget petty bourgeoisie and demanded a protection of freedom, a protection of the right to assemble, a protection of the right to strike, and so forth. They might have gotten real support. But you see, they were traumatized by the great general strike of March of 1920 in Germany. That general strike of March of 1920 had been really a massive affair at the time of the famous Top Push. Now, the Top Push of March of 1920 had been a right-wing push. Wolfgang Kopp was a high-ranking functionary with him, General von Riesbeck. They had seized the government for 4 days between the 13th and the 17th of March with the aid of the Freikorps, with the aid of freebooters, and they had knocked out the Social Democratic government. In response to that, Karl Liebknecht, who was the very reformist leader of the German trade union, had called a general strike, and it had been massive, and the Kopp government fell. And what the German communists did a year later was to look back at that action and say, you see, it is possible to pull off really an insurrectionary general strike without admitting the truth, which was that that strike of March of 1920 had been a mass strike, defensive, not offensive, and it had had the collaboration of the SPD and of the trade unions, none of which the communists could count on. But brushing aside those differences, they moved into the trap on the 21st of March, and for 10 days, from the 21st of March to the 2nd of April, you have the famous March Rising, which ended in such a disaster. Now, we cannot give you the history of that March Rising, or is it relevant to do so, except to say that in the history of those 10 days, the communists never had the support of really any more than a fraction of the German proletariat. There never were more than 200,000 people out on strike at any particular time. And certainly the SPD, the independent socialists and the unions were against it. Secondly, when a general strike was called on the 24th of March, there were very few workers who responded in cities outside of Prussian Saxony. You did not get the Berlin working class, for example, responding. Now this doesn't gainsay the fact that there is legend about this March rising and a great deal of heroism. That there were 2,000 workers, for example, who occupied the Leuna chemical works and beat off the police for 4 days in bloody clashes. That there was in the city of Hamburg a very famous rising, that the unemployed occupied 3 shipyards and set up workers' councils there and found from the mass, you see, their leader, a real peasant type, a stocky guy with ruddy face and a tremendous oratorical style, Teddy Ernst Heilmann. Heilmann, who becomes later the head of the German Communist Party, who becomes the very faithful kind of bureaucrat for Moscow. He is of that type, like William B. Foster, right out of the mass, who doesn't know how to function when he is in that leadership position, and who capitulates always ultimately to Moscow. But that Hamburg Rising for the 24th and 25th of March was really an impressive thing. They held those particular naval yards for those 2 days. Or consider the activity of Madison, which surely was the most dramatic of all activities in this insurrection. Madison wasn't really a communist in the KKK. Madison was Robin Hood. Madison knew only one thing from Marx: to eat according to his needs. And consequently, to went to the rob, and consequently, you distribute him. And what Madison did, as a kind of anarchic type, somebody much closer to the KAG than to the KKK, what Madison did was to go about among the unemployed, among the lumpen proletariat, and make a real army. And he really made an army. But it was an army that came to clash as much with organized workers as it did with the police and with the authorities. And Madison for 10 days really was remarkable, the core of the insurrection, but ultimately, you see, it all collapsed. And when it collapsed, it left 160 dead, and it left 3,500 in prison. And of the 300,000 that went on strike, I ask you to imagine how many were then blacklisted, how many by the thousands then suffered cold and hunger because they were not permitted to work. A disaster for the working class, a disaster for the German Communist Party. And you have to face that. And so the KKK held its Central Committee meeting on the 7th and 8th of April of 1921. And old Tsar Zetkin came forth and she said, well, face it, it was a catastrophe. And they said, well, what are you talking about? It was really a great step forward because it proved that we could act. It proved that we could function. It proved, after all, that we were an activist party. It is a step forward. And she said, but you used provocation, you led workers to their death and defeat, you did not prepare properly, and they refused to listen. And Paul Navy, who was still in the party, listened to all this and couldn't stand it. And consequently went outside the party, which is really led by mistake, and went outside the party and published a brochure by himself. And that pamphlet is called Our Way to Putschism. And it is a devastating pamphlet in which he says we have just experienced the greatest Bakuninist action since the death of Bakunin, which after all in Marxist terminology is very, very scatological language. And consequently, what Lenin is saying is that you did not have the workers organized, only 1/16 of the organized German working class within the Communist Party. There was no revolutionary situation. You provoked acts as though you were the worst police agent. You set unemployed against employed workers. You made a disaster, and why? Because, and here was, of course, the crux of Lenin's argument, because you listened to the false theories coming from the Comintern. And
for that, Levi was expelled from the German Communist Party on the 4th of May of 1921, and that expulsion was justified and confirmed by the Executive Committee of the Communist International on the 12th of June because of Levi's breaking of party discipline, which in fact he had done. But the question was, how was the Comintern use the March action? If this is, after all, the fulcrum of strategy, would it face up to it or would it not? And the Third Congress of the Communist International convened on the 29th of June and lasted until the 18th of July. And the March action was very much at the center of those debates. And you see them ran for cover. And Radek had the idea that the Comintern position should be that the Comintern line was right, but the preparations by the German communists were bad. That it really was a right action and a forward action, but it hadn't been properly prepared. And so he said that in his thesis. Now the German communist leaders didn't like that. They were taking the rap for Radek, and they didn't like that. And they said, no, it was a right action, it went forward, and we did right. And we advanced the whole cause until Trotsky threw up his hands. And Trotsky spoke bluntly at that Third Congress. And he said to the Germans, he said, it is the duty of the Communist International to warn its sections against artificially provoked movements of the kind which you have just given us a prime example. The Germans had friends among them, the Italians. And the Italians denounced Trotsky and said, after all, what you're doing is not admitting what a great action this was because you flushed out the reformists. No reformists will want now to be a communist. And Trotsky answered the Italians this way, there is more in the world, unfortunately, than just opportunists. There is also, I remind you, capitalist society. Also the police, the army, and precise economic conditions. A very complex world. We should be able to fuse the cold language of statistics to the impassioned will for revolutionary violence. And when Trotsky analyzed the March action at length, what he did really was to make a gloss on his very long report, which was on the world economic condition and the new task of the proletariat. Because what Trotsky did in a long and very brilliant intervention was to say that conditions really have changed, and we've got to admit that. That the insurrectionary period of 1918 and 19 really has passed, and there is a temporary, not very long, but a temporary stabilization in Europe, and that requires certainly new tactics. We are not now confronted with the chaotic and elemental assault that we witnessed in Europe in 1918 and 19. At that time, it seemed to us possible, with some historical justification, that the assault would mount and move forward in higher and higher ways. It was an historical probability, but it didn't happen. History has given to the bourgeoisie a fairly long breathing spell. The revolution is not so obedient, not so tame, that it can be led on a leash as we once imagined. And what Trotsky is saying is that what we must do now is to go to the masses. That became the watchword of the Third Congress. To go to the masses and to get into those organizations where they are and try to wean them away from their false leadership. To which he was attacked. He was attacked by Kohlheimer, the German communist, still defending himself and saying, you are taking our magnificent revolutionary energies and putting them in a cold storage. And Trotsky, with all of that magnificent arrogance that he could muster, said, do you not know that there is a new ruler in the world? Open your eyes. For the moment, there is a new ruler in the world, the American dollar. And Trotsky said that American dollar is stabilizing those conditions in Europe. It will for a period of time, and we must adjust to that. And he might not have prevailed, but of course, there was the rock of Lenin. And Lenin was ill by the time the Third Congress met. The Fourth Congress the next year would be his very last. You already have an extremely troubled and extremely exhausted man.
And he's someone who is concerned at the Third Congress to explain the new economic policy, not to analyze the German question. But he went nonetheless to the committee, the Central Committee meeting, the Executive Committee meeting of the Communist International, and he spoke about the German question. And he spoke extemporaneously since it was a meeting of the International and there were no translators, he spoke in French. And what he said was recorded by Victor Serge, who was there. And Victor Serge describes it this way. Delacroix kept his big round puffy face well lowered while Lenin talked. His sickly smile gradually faded away. Lenin, speaking in French, was brisk and harsh. 10 times or more he used the same phrase, les bêtises de Delacroix, the stupidities of Delacroix. Little words that turned his listeners to stone. And what Lenin was saying was that these fabricated or manufactured insurrections are destined to fail. It was all he said about the March action until the Third Congress was over. And then, at the end of the Third Congress, after it had disbanded, he wrote an open letter to the German Communist Party, a letter which is dated the 12th of August. And it is an extremely instructive document. It comes about 10 days before the KKK is to hold its Congress. And this is what Lenin in part writes. Dear comrades, I had intended to state my view of the lessons of the Third Congress of the Communist International in a detailed article. Unfortunately, I have not been able to start on this work because of ill health. The fact that a Congress of your party, the United Communist Party of Germany, has been called for August 22nd, compels me to hasten with this letter, which I have to finish within a few hours. There is the incontrovertible fact of the gradual swing to the left among the masses of workers, the real majority of the laboring and exploited people in Germany. Both those organized in the old Menshevik trade unions, that is, the unions serving the bourgeoisie, and those entirely unorganized. What the German proletariat must and will do, and this is the guarantee of victory, is to keep their heads, systematically rectify the mistakes of the past, steadily win over the masses of the workers both inside and outside the trade union, patiently build up a strong and intelligent communist party capable of giving real leadership to the masses at every turn of events, and work out a strategy that is on a level with the best international strategy of the most advanced bourgeoisie, which is enlightened by age-long experience in general and the Russian experience in particular. It is true that Lenin did all he possibly could, and much besides, to weaken and spoil his criticism and make it difficult for himself and others to understand the essence of the matter. While urging others to pursue a cautious strategy, Lenin himself committed worse blunders than a schoolboy by rushing into battle so prematurely, so absurdly and wildly that he was certain to lose a battle. Lenin is saying, why did he write that terrible brochure? But his criticisms are right. I defended and had to defend Lenin insofar as I saw before me opponents of his who merely shouted about his Menshevism and centrism and refused to see the mistakes of the Marx action and the need to explain and correct them. These people made a caricature of revolutionary Marxism and a pastime of the struggle against centrism. They might have done the greatest harm to the whole cause, for no one in the world can compromise the revolutionary Marxists if they do not compromise themselves. And what Lenin is saying is that you cannot simply sweep this dirt under the rug, that you must really confront this reality. The result was that when the Third Congress legislated and passed its resolution, it passed a resolution on the March action, which was critical. The March action represents a struggle forced on the KKK by the government's attack on the proletariat of Central Germany. In the course of this first great struggle since its foundation, the German Communist Party committed a series of errors. The most important of these consisted in not clearly emphasizing the defensive character of the action and pretending that there were the conditions for an offensive. And along with that resolution on the March action came another resolution which provided the strategy from here on for several years for the Communist Party. And it was the strategy of go to the mass, of the United Front, the United Front with those other organizations where there were workers in large numbers and tried to wheedle them away, tried, in a sense, to demystify them. All of this in Trotsky's terms until the conjuncture happened again. How long? How long would it take? How long destabilization? And for a brief moment, in 1923, it looked as though the moment had come again, and so there was another action in October of 1923 in Germany, and that ended it once and for all. The next action would be Hitler. And what happened in 1923? And Lenin by this time is almost dead, and Trotsky is denuded. And is suddenly taken up with the idea that there is a revolutionary condition. What happened was that in 1923, the aftermath that wasn't really predicted in 1921, Germany was in a mess. It is that famous year of 1923, the year of the Ruhr occupation. And suddenly you are confronted with a situation. And it is fundamentally exciting. Is it a revolution or isn't it? And you know about the Ruhr occupation. It happened on the 11th of January of 1923. And the French and the Belgians, but especially the French, 60,000 troops occupied the Ruhr. And they occupied it for most of that year. And in occupying the Ruhr, they cut off from German industry about 80% of its iron and steel, and about 70% of its coal, and they pulverized the German economy. Now, the background for that occupation of the Ruhr is quite obvious. The background has to do with reparations. And the reparations, after all, that the Reparation Commission, famous REPCO, had imposed upon the Germans was draconic and astronomical. Because they had come up in May of 1921 with a figure of 132 billion marks in reparations, which was a staggering figure to be paid 2 billion marks a year, plus 26% of the value of all exports. And consequently, a terrible draconian imposition upon the German economy. Now that has meant a crisis politically in Germany, because those terms that the Allies set had for a time been accepted by the German government of Joseph Beer. Joseph Beer, who was the leader of the Catholic Center Party, made a coalition government with the SPD in May of 1921, and until November of 1922, the German government of Beer tried to pay token payments of reparations until it broke down completely. And when it broke down completely and the Germans couldn't or wouldn't pay anymore, by the 14th of November of 1922, came another government, the government of Joseph Kuno, who represented the right. He was the president of the Hamburg America line, a great industrialist and capitalist, and he made a government for the first time without the socialists, a government of the right, and he presented their program to the Allies in London on the 9th of December of 1922, when he said, we want a 5-year moratorium on any reparations payment, plus loans from the outside in order to recover our economy. And to this, the French would not consent, and so Poincaré, who was the Prime Minister of France from January of 1922, that ardent foreigner, that patriot au fond, Poincaré insisted upon the occupation, oh yes, insisted upon it, closely tied to the Comité des Forges, closely tied to those French steelmakers and industrialists who wanted into the Ruhr, and consequently the occupation took place in January of 1923. And once the occupation took place, the German government proclaimed immediately passive resistance. And that passive resistance was tremendous, because what it meant was that no German functionary could collaborate with the French, cooperate in any way. And the industrialists shut down their factories, and the workers didn't produce, and consequently you had a kind of economic breakdown, almost complete in the Ruhr. The French and the Belgians have to bring in their own workers. They bring in railway workers, for example, to run the railway. They bring in police. They try to keep order, but everywhere there is sabotage, including the active sabotage of the nationalists of the right, like Lieutenant Schlosser, very important. Lieutenant Schlosser finally picked up by the French military authorities and executed on the 26th of May of 1923, an early hero of National Socialism. A lieutenant, after all, who bombed out the barracks of the French troops and who bombed the rails of the trains and so forth, and consequently a breakdown. But the breakdown even worse in the German economy. Mind you that a dollar, when the French occupied in January of 1923, a dollar was worth 17,000 marks. That by the time you get to August the 10th, the famous general strike in 1923 that overthrows Kuno, a dollar is worth 6 million marks. That by the time Stresemann begins his policy of negotiations on the 26th of September, a dollar is worth 50 billion marks, and with the insurrection in Hamburg, 75 billion marks. The point is that a month's pension, for example, for an old functionary or pensioner would buy a box of matches, that a month's handout to unemployed workers would not even buy a slice of bread, that you have a depreciated currency really that is no problem, it is worthless, and you have that tremendous suffering on the part of workers and of the petty bourgeoisie. And the critical moment, and this is the point, the critical moment came in May of 1923, but it's the moment that the German communists and the Comintern left out. In May of 1923, there was on the one hand a general strike in the Ruhr of 400,000 workers. They were all out. There was real paralysis, and you have on top of that terrific fraternization with French soldiers, because the French Communist Party, which hadn't done great things in its inglorious history, was horrific in the Ruhr. And in 1923, there had been a reorganization of that party in France. The centrists had been tossed out. For a moment, there were terrific guys like Lord Neville Monac in that leadership, and consequently, they sent emissaries to Essen on the 7th of January, 4 days before the occupation, and these French communists, like Cachin and Montmousseau and Senau, are addressing thousands of German workers and saying, "We are with you. And if troops come in, they will fraternize with you." They're calling meetings all over France against this occupation, and then, that jeunesse communiste, that communist youth was terrific. It was Gabriel Péry, magnificent guy, a victim of the Nazis in December of 1941, certainly the noblest figure out of that communist experience of the 1930s in France. Gabriel Péry, the head of that communist youth, who was in charge of that program to take l'humanité, banned by the military authorities in the Ruhr, of course, to take it and clandestinely diffuse literally tens of thousands of copies every day of l'humanité, urging the soldiers to fraternize, that they are workers in France, they can embrace these German workers, and by God they did. And there were by the hundreds of them brought before court-martials and sentenced to long terms, and by the thousands they went to meetings and cried simultaneously, "Down with Poincaré, down with Stinnett." The idea was that the fight was a dual fight, both of them had the same enemy. And you see that is important to exploit, because the German nationalists, after all, in the Ruhr, had a different angle. Their angle was to say that we want a national struggle against the occupier. Afraid, you see, of this demystification of saying that the real enemy is not only the French, but Stinnett and Kissen and the steel barons at home also, and consequently wants to mystify it. And there is this magnificent old, when he wasn't old then, but this magnificent Burgermeister in Cologne in 1923, who organizes a separatist movement for the Ruhr and says, all of us, German capitalists and workers together, we must fight against this French invader. His name was Konrad Adenauer, and Adenauer, in there, you see, as Burgermeister of Cologne, already has the idea of where the real enemy is. The real enemy is demystification, and consequently that was the moment for the German communists to move and to say, we will have our insurrection against the occupier because the French soldiers will not fire on us, and also against our own masters. But no. Traumatized by the events of March, In March of 1921, ahead of the masses, in May of 1923, miles behind them. And consequently, when they met in Central Committee in Essen, they said, no, we want the workers to disarm. We want them to disarm. We cannot have putschist activity. And they would not have that insurrection until the Comintern intervened. The Comintern finally, in August of 1923, at the time that there was a general strike that overthrew Kuno and brought in Gustav Stresemann to work with the German, with the Social Democrats again, and consequently the real hump of the agitation was over. When that happened, then the Comintern acted and said, yes, insurrection now. And they brought Brandler to Moscow for a month to train him for Brandler. And he went to Moscow in the month of September, and everywhere there were signs saying, welcome, leader of the world, revolution. And consequently, he was used and thought that that was it. And they went back, the Germans, and in October tried their insurrection. In fact, in Thuringia, in the final denouement in Hamburg, all of it too late, all of it a crushing defeat. By the end of 1923, all of that hope is gone, and you really are